Hello, everyone. A very warm welcome to all of you to my channel. Thanks for coming back. And whoever are new people, I welcome them to this channel and urge them to like, share, subscribe the video if you like it. So, in the previous video, we talked about the best practices and considerations for a role of business analyst or a business process consultant or a business process architect in ServiceNow ecosystem. Now, similarly, as a part of that role, we have studied that you have to write user stories, you have to write epics, features, all that stuff. You have to do it in reality to ensure that project has the right requirements gathered in the right format. And then after that, you can actually build the stories in system, whatever system is applicable. And then the entire project is actually built on that story. So if you have the story, then only that feature will be delivered, right? This is how it works. So ensuring that you have the stories rightly structured, rightly documented, then only you can ensure that project is on a successful track. Now, let me talk further about how to do this in real world, right? A lot of people know about it, but I'm just giving you some basic considerations, some basic examples, which will help you further in terms of how to write a story, how to gather a requirement, and write it in the format of a feature or a story or an epic, right? So nowadays, generally, most of the customers actually use agile methodology. So there is a concept of invest criteria. This is a standard practice across the industry. So not only for service now, for any product right now you work on and you are using agile methodology, generally you are supposed to write stories in that principle, using that principle of invest. We'll talk about it in detail. Whoever do not know about invest principle, that how do we use it in real world. But I'm just giving you a very high level guideline right now that if you're using agile methodology, it is better that you write story in an invest criteria. And generally, as a BA or a BPC, it is always recommended that you have this business requirement documents, generally called as BRD, at a high level, so that everybody knows what we are trying to achieve at a functional level in terms of flow. Because generally, stories don't have a flow; they are individual in themselves, right? So it becomes difficult for people to understand the sequence of events and understand the overall project delivery approach. That will be a good thing to document it in BRD, or you can document it in a design document. You can document it anywhere. I'm just telling you that you should document the entire journey somewhere in a bigger document apart from user stories, which can help give a bigger picture to your customer base, to your stakeholders as well. You may not need it in some cases, which is fine, but yeah, if it is a full-fledged implementation, it is always advisable that you have a BRD document as well. Now, you can use Jira. There are multiple tools and system in organizations and corporates which people use to write stories. Jira is very quite popular. In fact, even ServiceNow has given an option to write all the stories, to maintain those epics, features, sprints, releases, everything. So they have a concept of strategic portfolio management, under which they have project management and safe framework, agile development. All of these modules, they are there in ServiceNow, which will help you to write epics feature stories in a very well-defined format. You have all the formats there. You have all the linkages that this epic is related to this feature is related to this story, and this story has this task, this is dependent on this. All of that stuff, whatever you need to maintain for a story at a story level, or for maintaining a sprint or a release plan, you can do it in ServiceNow also. As I said, you can do it in Jira or any other tool which your organization uses, right? Now, if you're using, for example, waterfall hybrid model, in that case, BRD becomes the most important document, because generally, they give you everything together and then you have to write everything together and give it to the development team. So BRD is a must in this situation wherever you have a waterfall kind of approach. And then if you don't have any tools like Jira, or maybe, not even SPM or Agile Development Framework or Service now, then you can always use an Excel sheet or any other tool, whatever they offer, clients offer, or you as a service provider offer to clients. And just agree a format that this is how you will write stories. So the point I'm trying to mention here is that initially itself, when you start your workshops for requirement gathering, at that time itself, you should be very clear in terms of what would be the approach going forward. How will you write stories? Who will give sign off on those stories? How will the stories be transitioned from one stage to another? All that understanding, all that process framework has to be agreed with the stakeholders, so that everybody is in sync in terms of how will be a requirement captured in a story or a feature or an epic, and how will it be delivered till the end. So that entire process of gathering it, analyzing it, handing it over to development team for designing, for architecture, textual discussions, and for development and for testing, because same story will be used for everything. You don't need to write different stories for different phases, right? So generally, I've seen even since some situations, people do write different stories for different phases. This is not the best practice, if you ask me, because if you can do same thing in same story, just assign it to the right team. For example, when it is in the requirement gathering phase or analysis phase, you should assign it to BA team. If it is in design phase, assign it to architect, that team who's looking to designing the solution. If it is in development phase, assign it to development team. If it's in testing phase, assign it to testing team. If it's in deployment phase, assign it to deployment team, right? So this is how you can avoid that duplication, writing five different stories the same thing for different phases. You should always write only one story, and you should move it across phases across in any system. So right now it is in requirement gathering phase, it is in analysis phase, it is in design phase, it is in development phase, it is in test deployment phase, delivery, whatever phases you have defined. So the point I'm trying to explain here is that whatever methodology you apply, waterfall, hybrid, agile, or whatever, right? That approach has to be communicated to all the stakeholders, and you as a BPC would be accountable to communicate this approach to ensure that everyone is on the same page and take that input, right? If there is something which is at an organizational level which you might need to change in as from the best practice, you might need to change it, you might need to accommodate, they might have their own reasons to do it. So the point is, whatever is the approach, you should agree it, you should formulate it, document it, and then get the sign off. This is how we are going to deliver this project end to end from all the stages, right? And who RACI metrics is very important here, that who is accountable for which stage the story. This is also important. Now, when you've done all that approach definition, how will the things be progressed further? Then the real thing will come to play, that doing it, right? For example, you have to write epics, you have to write features, you have to write stories, and link them together. Because generally, so if I explain it a little bit further, Epic is something, it's quite bigger in terms of its scale, in terms of scope. For example, if I say incident management is something which I have to deliver in this quarter, so that would be an Epic for you. That incident management itself is an Epic. Now, in incident management, you have a lot of things to do. For example, you have to configure SLAs, you have to define notifications, you have to define some flows, you have to define major incident management. Those will become features. So Epic is the biggest thing in this case, which generally gets takes a quarter or 2 months at least to deliver, right? When you talk about features, it is something which can be delivered in 2-3 sprints. But then you should be very clear in terms of sequence of events, right? You should, the stories which you're writing in those features should be interlinked with each other in terms of making sure that if you are developing, for example, incident notifications feature, right? Now you might have multiple notifications for an incident at different stages to different audience. You might not be able to deliver all of them in one single sprint. So what you can do is, maybe in one sprint you can take incident notifications for end users. In second sprint, you can take incident notifications for the stakeholders. In third, you can say, assignment groups or SLA breaches, whatever is required for those notifications. So that is why I would call it as a feature rather than story, because you might have more than 20-25 notifications in a particular module, which might need to be configured. So that may not be achievable in a particular sprint. That is why it is divided generally into 2-3 sprints, and you can call it as a feature. So feature is a little bigger thing than a story, but the point here is that a feature has to be associated to an epic, because ultimately all of these things are being developed as a part of an epic, which is incident management in this case. And then stories will come forward. Stories will be, a little bit in terms of sizing. It is of course smaller. It should be in a particular, it should be part of a particular feature, and it should be smaller enough that it can be delivered in that particular sprint, because in one sprint that story has to be delivered. So you generally in a sprint, you might have stories of 10, 20, whatever the stories, depending on the capacity of the team who's developing it. Or if you have a big team, then you're going to have more stories, which is fine. But the idea is that story, whatever story you're writing, which is in a particular sprint, should be delivered in the sprint. That is the whole idea. And for example, you might need to upload some foundation data like user data, like group data. You have to configure incident SLAs. You have to configure change risk. So all these smaller things which can be done actually in a particular sprint should be a part of this story. Now, only thing I'm trying to ensure here is that that story should be linked to a particular feature, so that you are sure that by the end of 3 sprints or 4 sprints, I should be able to deliver this feature end to end, because I have taken all the stories in that feature which are supposed to be delivered. This is how it works, right? And there is one more thing which generally people forget, because generally people talk about epic feature stories, they don't talk about task, subtask. So this is an interesting thing and an important thing, because generally what happens is, because story is something which you actually deliver, you develop in a system and you deliver, it can be tested, it can have multiple parameters. It has a particular format that this is what I am supposed to get out of the story. Task is something which is, acting as a dependency. That, for example, I have to upload data. Now, for uploading data, I need to first gather data from the customer side, right? Similarly, I need to understand whether this will be done manually or this will be done automatically. This is an approach which has to be considered, which has to be finalized before actually doing a story. So that can be those kind of things which are actually not deliverables in terms of value addition, in terms of showing it in a demonstration, but they have to be done to ensure that your stories have all the required information to be delivered. That is why these tasks and subtasks are also important to be tracked, because otherwise, what happens is people generally lose track of these things, and that is why at some point of time you lose the focus on the story, and you tend to move it further from one sprint to another sprint, because you don't have the task completed, and because people don't uh, track that task somewhere, that is why they miss on it sometimes. So this is where it becomes very important that you also track those tasks and subtasks which are required to ensure that story has all the enough information, right? Now let's move further. Give me a second. Right. So now I'll talk more specific things to ServiceNow, because I think in the last slide we talked about general considerations, how to write user stories, how to write epics, what to do. I mean, we talked about what actually, not how. How we will talk now. We talked about more of how, what things, that what all has to be written. Now, if you see this, right, generally what happens is people don't consider sequence of stories. So because a lot of stories are dependent on each other, that is why it is very important to understand the sequence. So when you design the entire plan as a BPC, this is how I will be delivering the entire module. You should be very much clear in terms of what will you need first, what will you need second, what is the day three thing, what is the day four thing, for example. And you will always have situations where point number two is dependent on point number one, point number three is dependent on point number two. So this sequence must be very clear in your mind, right? And just to help on that little further, that what kind of things you can consider, that kind of dependencies you can have for a particular project. Now, for example, the first one, if you see foundation data, if you do not have foundation data, believe me, nothing's going to work. If you remember, even in my previous session, I talked about data is very, very, very important for any module to be implemented in ServiceNow, right? And generally, people don't give that focus on it, and they tend to delay it uh, further in the game. But this is where it becomes a problem statement at the end of the day. And this is where the entire thing has been done. Just because you don't have data, you are not able to close the things. So it is very important that you should have foundation data and system. You may not need the entire thing, but depending on the scope of the project, whatever you are supposed to implement, you should have the basic information. For example, users, what are their groups, what are departments, business units. I mean, you may not need department, business unit, companies, customers, but whatever is expected for you to have in the system, you should make a list of that, and all those things which are very important, which are prerequisites, they have to be there in system, right? So, and it is the first thing which has to be there in system. Of course, after doing that as is versus to be, what is the current situation of customer, what is, you've done all of that homework already during your analysis, and this is the area where you're delivering it. So this is very much later in the game, when you've done the requirement gathering, you've understood the problem statement of the customer, you know what is to be delivered, you know as is versus to be, you've designed the product, you know what is to be done when. So now this is the time when you have to actually do the things in system and showcase the value to the customer in terms of demonstrations. This is where it becomes very important that you are very clear about the sequence of stories. As I said, foundation data is one of the first things. Second thing, if, for example, if foundation data is not supposed to be done manually, right? Nobody wants to upload foundation data manually. So you might need an integration with LDAP, from AD, from different other systems, internal systems, customers, whatever they have, right? Now, if that integration has to be done and foundation data has to be loaded through through those integration systems, then your integration stories should be the first thing to be implemented, because they're complex ones also, because you have some considerations to be done while integrating things. So at that time, it becomes very important that we do those integrations, bring the foundation data, and then only move further. Now, I can say one thing here. For example, you can have some dummy data, for example, just to understand the format. Okay, this is how a user data looks like. This is how a group data looks like. So maybe for some POCs, for the basic stuff, you can have some sample records. But to get the real data in system, you should always do some integrations, and those stories should be the first thing to be done, right? Next, you can say plugins. So depending on the module you want to implement, for example, you want to implement major incident management workbench. For that, you might need a plugin. You want to deploy CAP workbench, you might need a plugin. So there are so many things in ServiceNow which are activated only when a particular plugin is enabled. Without that, that particular thing cannot be done. So that is why it is very important to understand if there is a plugin requirement, and if there is any, ensure that that story is in the very top in the sequence in terms of getting it done. Because without that particular plugin, you can't do anything. You can't show those tables, you can show those menus, show those applications, nothing. So those plugin has to be the first thing after the foundation data, which has to be enabled, or even before foundation data to go on, because there might be some things, this is not number one, number two, number three. It is just some considerations I'm talking about, which you must consider when you are writing stories. So if, for example, if you want to put some data in customer service management, now if you have not enabled customer service management plugin itself, you can't put the foundation data, because it requires products, sold products, install base items, accounts, a lot of things are there for CSM. Now, in that case, those plugins have to be enabled first. So that is how you should do it. You should consider it. Now, for example, there could be stories for prerequisites. For example, you're implementing some kind of ITOM module in ServiceNow, where you're doing discovery, event management, service mapping. Then you have to ensure that you have the mid-server stories for mid-server configurations. You have the stories for mid-server deployments. The stories for whatever is required for that particular mid-server to be operational. These are some important things. They might not be functional stories, but they are technical stories for sure, which are prerequisites for your functional thing to be done, right? So you have to have those stories in place, because if you don't have these basic things in place, then it'll be a problem later on. Now, then comes your workflow configuration, customize, which is the actual thing you're doing in ServiceNow in terms of adding value to customer, right? Whatever workflow you're supposed to develop, configure, customize. This is where your stories will be there. You have your forms and fields. So generally, when your incident moves from one state to another, for example, new to open, or open to work in progress, or work in progress to resolved or on hold, then you have some forms, fields, that these are the fields, mandatory fields to be done from this flow to this flow, right? What all is visible on the form, what all is not visible to the form, to whom it is visible, to whom it is not visible, who has edit rights, who does not have edit. So all those permissioning stories, forms and field stories, configuration customization stories for that particular form and field have to be there, right? So this is giving you a very high level understanding that these are the kind of stories you should develop, you should write, to ensure that the project is in the right track. That's the whole idea. Now, there might be some data which is beyond foundation data, which you have to upload, for example, SLA data, right? For example, any historical records, which is for, I mean, you want to migrate some incidents from historical systems to this new system. So all those things have to be done beyond foundation data if it is a requirement for a particular module, right? Now, generally in ServiceNow, whenever you implement a workflow or a business process automation thing, right, you generally have notifications, you generally have approvals, you generally have tasks. All of those things have to be considered, and these are the stories which you have to write. For example, whenever your incident breaches an SLA, it should trigger a notification to the assignee, to his manager, after a certain period of time, right? Or you might have an escalation metrics configured in system because of which configuring SLAs or notifications, right? So point is, these are very important things. Notifications are there in most of the modules in ServiceNow. Approvals are there in most of the modules in ServiceNow. Even you have a lot of tasks in different stages. For example, you are raising a request from system, and that request has to go. You have multiple requested items in that. So for all those multiple requested items, you might have multiple tasks also. So all those tasks, this is just one example. You can have tasks for changes, you can have tasks for problems, you can have tasks for incidents, for everything you can have tasks. for hardware asset management, software asset management. For everything in ServiceNow, you have these things generally: approvals, notifications, tasks, data, form, field, workflows. I mean, these are the bread and butter of ServiceNow, right? This is the entire platform we're talking about here. So those kind of stories have to be written for sure, right? So this is a guideline in terms of, so that it can give you some picture. Okay, if I have to implement a project, what kind of stories do I need to write? What kind of things do I need to consider? So these are the things which you have to consider there, right? For example, stories for automated assignments, for multiple, for example, if this incident belongs to this category, it should be assigned to this. All those kind of stuff has to be done. Stories for doing some orchestrations, for integrating with some different integration systems, for automating some tasks, right? All of those things have to be written. And last but not least, reports and dashboards. Generally, people don't give that much attention to reports and dashboards, but believe me, when you deliver the value to the customer, eventually this is what which is going to give them the real value. If they are not able to pull out the required reports from and the dashboards, which give them that information, enough information, so that they can take some decisions to improve things, it will not work out for them. You will not be able to showcase the value which you have achieved over a period of time. So reports and dashboards have to be consulted with all the stakeholders, understood very well, tell them whatever is available out of the box, and understand if they need anything beyond out of the box also. So that kind of information has to be clearly mentioned in the stories. So reporting and dashboard, you just can't forget it. Yeah, it is very, very important. So these are some cases, considerations. I mean, if I start talking about all the stories, it will be a very big session. I just want to talk about the high level understanding that these are the points you need to consider whenever you're writing any stories. And it is irrespective of any module. Whatever module you implement in ServiceNow, these are the things which will be there mostly. Okay. Now let's move to the next slide. Right. So far we have talked about what to write, what to consider. Then we talked about uh, you know at a high level what all things are required for particular implementation. Now here I'm talking about how do you actually write a story in system. Now, if you remember in one of the slides I talked about use the invest principle. Now this is not something specific to ServiceNow, as I mentioned earlier also. This is clearly industry standard framework which we can use everywhere for every product. Now, all it tries to say is that these are 7 principles which you have to follow while you write a story. And it is not subjective, it is clearly objective principles which are given to you just to ensure that you understand them well. For example, I stands for independent. So, for example, whatever stories you're writing, you should ensure that this is enough story to deliver that particular thing in that particular sprint. You are not waiting for anything else to happen or anything else, you're not dependent on anything else to showcase the value of that particular story in that sprint. So that story should be independent of other stories in terms of showcasing the value, right? That is very important. Negotiable that. And when I say negotiable, this is very interesting word that client can tell you this is what I want, right? And given that you have expertise of service now, you can tell them I can give you what you want, but not may not be in the same way exactly as you're looking for. Because service now out of the box works in a certain way, and this requirement can be fulfilled in this way rather than the way you are looking at. For example, they're visualizing something that okay, this should happen, this should happen, this should happen, step by step. And we are saying, no, we cannot go to that level of granularity that it should happen exactly this, like exactly like this. So it should have that room for negotiations where solutioning is controlled by you, so that you can tell them this is how we are doing it because it is the best practice. We have done it for multiple customers. It is also ensuring that we are sticking to the out of the box things, and that is where it will become easier for you to upgrade later on as well, and you will not have much issues because it is a supported feature from ServiceNow. So that negotiable factor actually is talking about that you should be able to negotiate on the solutioning part, on the actual look and feel part. It may not be exactly same as what customer want, but as long as it fulfills their requirement, then it should be good. So you should have that room for negotiation. Valuable that if I deliver the story, then this is the value I'm getting from the story. That is why you always write a story in a certain format. We'll talk about it in a certain while. But every story has to have a value attached to it. I mean, you should be able to demonstrate that story at the end of it, and this should show that because of this story, I have achieved this particular functionality or achieved this particular outcome. Now, when I say estimable, when I say estimable, it simply means that the story has enough information in itself that my team will be able to estimate it in terms of whether we'll be able to deliver it in one sprint, or it will require two sprints, or it has to be decomposed, or it is a large story, complex story, small story, whatever. I mean, the story should have that information in system that the team who's working on it can easily estimate it. Small, as I said, story is not an epic, it is not a feature, it has to be delivered in that sprint. So ideally speaking, it should be small enough that it can be delivered in that sprint. You can't do everything in one story, right? So it is very important that you should be very clear in terms of what exactly can I do in this particular sprint, and later on I can do the next things in the next sprint. Or you have a different story in the same sprint for doing that thing. Do not club everything under a single story. For example, if I talk about incident screen, which is okay, but if you're talking about incident screen, open should have this, in work in progress should have this, in resolve should have this. So I would recommend having individual stories for all the screens, for all the workflows, rather than having everything in one single story. Because then you might have a situation where you are not able to deliver the entire thing in that sprint because of multiple dependent factors. So that is how you should decompose a story. That particular story somebody is working on, they should be able to do it in that sprint. It is smaller enough. And when I say testable, right? So it is very important that somebody who is doing the testing of a story from the from the testing team, internal QA team, or the business UAT team, they should understand what they have to test. I mean, story should be specific enough in terms of talking about what should I do, how should I test it. This is what you generally do using this acceptance criteria. This is where you write an acceptance criteria which is good enough to allow testers to test the stories. We'll talk about it in now. Okay, how do you write acceptance criteria? Now, before that, let's talk about how do you write a story, right? So generally, a story in a industry standard framework is written like as a particular persona, maybe a service delivery manager or a customer service executive or a support team member or a manager. I want to do a certain thing so that I can achieve a certain result. This is how it becomes very, very easy for everyone to understand why do you want to do it, first of all, for whom do you want to do it, and what exactly do you want to do it. So all those basic questions are answered in this particular format. That is why this format becomes very, very important, and that is why people recommend to write stories in this format so that everybody understands who is trying to achieve what and how. Right now, once you've written a story, we'll talk about some examples in the next slide also, that how do you write a story. And then when you talk about acceptance criteria format, this is for testing purposes, as I said, right? So once the story is completed, delivered, at that time you should be able to test it. Now, to test it, you should know what to test, you should know how to test. So this is where your acceptance criteria helps you how to do testing. Now, this is on a particular format. For example, given a condition, that given this happens, when I take an action, then I expect this result. This is how you write an acceptance criteria. Now we'll talk about this using example as well, but I hope the format is at least clear to you, that what exactly we are trying to write here and how. Now let's understand it from a very easy example. So I'll talk about an example in the next slide. This is where I can give you the example based on which I have written. So the format I've written, now based on that format, we are writing the story. Now, for example, the requirement was that the customer is telling you that you have to configure SLAs for P1, P2, P3, P4 incidents. And so that my team can, actually work on the incidents accordingly, and we can provide the required service to the customers, to our customers, or to our end users, whoever, right? Now, this is where you're writing the story as a particular persona. Now, in this case, whoever is service provider, they'll have a service desk manager or a service level agreement manager, SLA manager, or service level manager, whatever you want to call it as. Now, they, as that manager of the team, they want to configure SLAs for the incident so that their team can respond to those incidents as per the required service level agreements, and we can provide the required service or expected service to customer as per the agreement. This is where the persona comes into place. Service desk manager, what they want to do, they want to configure SLAs. Why? So that their team can respond to specific incidents. This is how you have consumed the format called as a I want and so that. So this is where you talk about the persona. This is where you talk about the actual action, and this is where you talk about the objective or whys of those action. This is what, this is why, this is who and for whom. Right? This is where it becomes the complete story. Now this is the story. Now, uh, now how do I test it? How do I ensure that it is complete? This is where I tell the acceptance criteria that this is once this acceptance criteria is achieved, I can say that story has been delivered. Now, what is this criteria? So if you remember, we talked about given, when, then format. So given a certain precondition, when I take some action, then this should happen. Similarly, in this case, given that I log into system as a service desk manager, when I raise an incident with a specific priority in system, then what should happen? Then that particular SLA for that incident, for that priority should be triggered immediately. I raise that incident. For example, I'm raising a P1 incident, then that P1 incident SLA, whatever I've defined, should be triggered immediately and should be visible to me under SLA tab. So when you see the incident form, when you go to further down the form, you have something called SLAs. Now in that SLA, you can showcase response SLA and resolution SLA, for example. Now for that priority, you have defined that SLA somewhere. How will I test it? Now, you might have defined anything in the backend, but if it is not working in the front end, it does not make any sense to me as an end user, as a service desk manager, right? So this is where this is helping testers and end users to test that story. Okay, I have raised an incident with P1 or P2 or P3 or P4. The moment I raise it, I submit it, I can see my SLAs which are associated with that incident in that tab and can tell me this is the SLA which is triggered for this particular incident because of this priority. And this is how you have response SLAs, resolution SLAs, on hold SLAs. This is how you generally write an acceptance. Now, this gives enough understanding to a tester, whether it is from internal QA team or it is from business users, that they can read it and they can actually take these actions and confirm whether yes, it is working for them. The story can be closed and we are good with this. This is how you do the entire process of user stories. I hope the session was useful to you guys. Thank you very much. If you have not yet liked or subscribed to my channel, please do so and share the video with your friends, whoever you think can, whoever can benefit from this. I'll be really happy. Thank you very much, everyone.